and welcome to the 5 Central Concepts of Philosophy. The 5 central concepts are truth, biased, ideas, questions, and reflection. First one we're going to talk about is truth. Truth, like knowledge, is surprisingly difficult to define. We seem to rely on it almost every moment of every day, and it's very close to us. Yet, it's difficult to define because as soon as you have it pinned down, some case or counter-example immediately shows deficiencies. Ironically, every definition of truth that philosophers have developed falls prey to the question, is it true? There is a lifelong journey to search for the truth. So what is bias? Imagine that your neighbor has invited you to see his child's school play, and since you like the child, you agree to go. After sitting through the play, everyone who attended is handed a score sheet and asked to score each child's performance on a scale of 1 through 10. Although this is a hypothetical scenario, the odds are fairly good that you would give your neighbor's child a higher score. Not because she was the best, but because you have a personal relationship with her and you like her. In my hypothetical situation, the preference shown for your neighbor's child is what is known as bias, which is a lack of objectivity or an inclination to favor one thing or person over another. For example, if I hire a man for a particular job because I believe that men are better workers than women, I could accurately be described as having a bias against women in the workplace. Depending on whom you ask, bias can have a very complicated definition, but in the simplest terms, it means that you have a one-sided point of view about something which tends to influence decisions and opinions about other things. So who experiences bias? Biases affect nearly every part of our social lives, from harmless acts like favoring your children over others to problematic or dangerous biases like believing that white people are superior to other races. While it is possible that neither of those apply to you, it is important to remember that everyone, no matter how objective a person you may be, has biased opinion about something. For example, in the Jim Crow South, racial bias led to African Americans being segregated and treated differently than whites. Although bias tends to be associated with the negative outcomes, such as gender or racial biases, it is not always quite so serious or detrimental. For example, being biased when it comes to one's own children would probably be considered a good thing because it improves bonding. So, some types of bias. Because bias influences so many different parts of our lives, researchers in psychology and sociology have identified several types of bias in order to differentiate one from the other. While it would be impossible to cover all of them in this lesson, the following 5 types should help you understand the different ways in which our lives are affected by bias. The first one, attentional bias. Attentional bias is the way that our recurring thoughts affect our perceptions. For example, if you have recently bought a new car that you love and are proud of, you might begin to notice other people driving the same car, whereas you wouldn't have noticed this before you got the car. This effect is related to the fact that your new car is on your mind after having bought it, and it is affecting your perception, particularly what you do and do not notice around you. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret or remember things so that they align with your own beliefs or values. If I was a terribly anxious person, for example, I might hear a news report about a rise in crime rates and become convinced that my chances of being murdered have just tripled. In this case, it wouldn't matter that the rise in crime is related to shoplifting in another state, because confirmation bias has caused me to hear only the pieces of the news story that confirm what I already believe to be true, while blocking out the disconfirming information. Third type, negativity bias. Although it's fairly self-explanatory, negative bias is the tendency to focus or remember only the negative aspects of an experience. People who possess a negative bias tend to overfocus on bad things, which clouds their ability to see or remember good things. Social comparison. One of the more harmful types, social comparison bias, is the tendency to make decisions regarding another person based on how he or she compares to you. For example, if a wife introduces her husband to two new friends that happens to be a man and a woman, he might discourage her from socializing with the man because he feels threatened or is worried that the new friend is in some ways better than him. The last type of bias we'll talk about is gambler's fallacy. Gambler's fallacy is a type of bias that affects our perception of probability in certain circumstances. If I was a person who was affected by gambler's fallacy, who had just lost on 10 lottery tickets, I would probably go back and buy 10 more based on the belief, because I had just lost 10 times, the odds of my winning must be improved dramatically, even though the actual probability is much lower. Now we come to ideas. What are ideas? Ideas are usually constructed as a mental representational image of some object. Ideas can also be abstract concepts that do not present a mental image. Many philosophers have considered ideas to be a fundamental ontological category of being. The capacity to create and understand meaning of ideas is considered to be essential and a defining feature of human beings. In a popular sense, an idea arises in a reflective, spontaneous manner, even without thinking or serious reflection. For example, when we talk about the idea of a person or place, a new or an original idea can often lead to innovation. Questions. Everyone has a little bias and makes assumptions as they make decisions and develop their beliefs. That's natural. The classic Greek philosopher Socrates, around 470 to 400 BC, taught a way of questioning during learning and decision making that helps sift out irrational or incorrect thinking. Through Socratic questioning, teachers can push themselves and their students to come up with answers to problems, not just the easy answers, but the best answers. Socrates' teaching method focused on encouraging his students to ask why about the philosophical questions that they had. It was based on challenging assumptions, clarifying an accepted meaning of evidence, identifying bias and perceptions, and really considering consequences and implications of decisions or conclusions. Teachers know that teaching is always changing, as in the school environment within which they operate. So, thinking the same thing the same way won't work for any school. Educators need to understand how to make thoughtful decisions. There are 6 types or reasons for questions. The 6 types are conceptual clarification, so what does this mean? Why do you think that? Probing assumptions, so you're looking at What are you assuming? What happens if those assumptions change? Probing evidence. Is your explanation the only explanation? Is the evidence enough for proof? Questioning perceptions. Why would you think that? Who benefits from thinking that? Probe consequences. What would that mean if true? What happens if it changes? Questions about the questions. Why does it matter? What happens if you change the question? Questions are best used in finding ideas and solutions to problems in education. Educators need to think deeper, not rely on surface level information. Look at the factors and underlying causes that cause problems in your classroom and school. Reflection. The results reveal reflection to be a powerful mechanism behind learning, confirming the words of American philosopher, psychologist, and education reformer John Dewey. He states, "We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience." In fact, these beneficial effects seem to be lasting. Reflection is one of the three logical acts of understanding by which concepts are generated as to their form, the other two being comparison and abstraction. Reflection is defined as the going back over of different presentations. How can they be comprehended in one consciousness? Reflection, comparison, and abstraction are essential and general conditions of generating any concept whatsoever. The internal voice of reflection is self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is difficult to describe in detail, but we can define it as both what and how we are thinking. Self-knowledge includes ways of thinking that may not be visible to us consciously. If the goal is not merely coverage but actual learning, then reflection is no longer optional. It is an essential piece to transition a classroom from covering material to being focused on learning. There's something about the word reflection that seems to make teachers uncomfortable. Maybe it's too touchy-feely for some. Maybe it's because it requires adults to show humility and admit they can improve. Regardless, if we're not willing to practice it ourselves and model it for our students, how can we ever hope to see them reflect on their own mistakes? Reflection is an integral part of the learning process. It allows us to learn more about ourselves and how we learn, but it also aids us in improving academic skills. Consider sports teams that watch film of the previous night's game. They're able to identify mistakes and correct them at practice. Looking at a failed math test can have the same result if we help the students to notice, "Oh, I forgot to carry the one every time I borrowed." Then we can look back on the learning process as well and help students discern which activities worked well for them and which ones didn't.